Well, the time has arrived, and I think we will get started. I would like to have a lot of discussion in this class. In the last two classes that we had here, it was mostly lecture. This time I would like to have a lot of discussion. Our goal in this class is not to tell you why you should keep the Sabbath. We're assuming that you all are Sabbath keepers. And so in this book we try to give you reasons why, or why God did this, or why did God do that? Is it relevant to us today? Those are the kind of goals that we have for this book. The author of the book is a familiar name. My son wrote the book. A little bit about him. He grew up in a Sabbath-keeping home. He never knew any different than that. We always kept the Sabbath from the day he was born and before. So it was very practical to him, and that's all he knew. At my church in Pennsylvania, we always had a meeting on Friday evening to start the Sabbath. And then we would come home, and since Friday, as we'll look at it in some of the chapters, Friday was a preparation day, and my wife, Larry's mother, was a great baker. And she would bake pies and cakes, and that was part of her preparation day, baking and getting ready. One little example, when we came home from church one evening, Friday evening, and we sat around the table as we always do, but there was only one pie there. And Larry spoke up, "Whoever thought of making only one pie?" He was accustomed to more than that, because on Sabbath day, when we went to church, well, when we got up in the morning, my wife would put the roast or whatever in the oven and set the timers and stuff so that it would be ready when we came home from church. And we would go to church on Sabbath morning. We would have Sabbath school and so on, come home. We always knew that we would have company for dinner on Sabbath day. We never knew who. My wife didn't even know who, but she prepared for them. And when we went to church, she would invite whoever she wanted to come home with us for dinner. We had a number of members that drove quite a distance through the mountains from wherever down to New Enterprise, where our church was. So anyhow, Larry grew up with the Sabbath. He knew the Sabbath all of his life. And of course, when it came time to, well, I would mention this. When Larry finished high school and he was ready to go to college, he went to college to be a physical therapist. That was his goal. When he finished college, he was ready to be a pastor. Changed his mind. And of course, during that time, he met Janny during a SCSE experience.
No.
And I forget where they were. And he met Janny, and of course they got married. They were Sabbath keepers. And in this first chapter, he talks about the good china and the everyday china. Now, I think you guys can relate to this, every one of you, and I want an example from each of you in a few minutes here. But I'll review for those who did not read the book yet, or the first chapter. Larry starts out talking about his home, where they had a china cabinet. Actually, it was the same one he grew up with. But they had a china cabinet, and in there was good china. I mean, it was a perfect set of 12. No chips, no scratches. It was it was silver, laced around the edge, and a design on there. And that was the good china, and they kept it in this china cabinet with a glass on the front so that you could look in and see how wonderful this set of china dishes was. Then they had another set, like most of you use, during the week, and they don't always match, you know, and there's a few chips or scratches, and one cup is cracked a little, and those are the ones that we use for every day, and they serve us well. But those dishes in the cupboard, they were used only on special occasions. And when we did get them out of the cabinet and use them, they were handled very carefully. We didn't put them in the dishwasher with the other dishes. We washed them by hand, we dried them by hand, and placed them back into the china cabinet with care to preserve them. Okay, now each of you has a similar experience in your home, that the Sabbath day is different in one way or another. Example, you guys don't go to school on the Sabbath, you don't go to work, you don't do a lot of different things. You do come to church, and so I would like to hear from you what's different in your house on the Sabbath day than it is the other days of the week, the ordinary china. Okay.
Sabbath afternoon naps.
Afternoon, hey, I'm with you on that.
I don't do that during the week.
Employer might frown on that. I try not to stress about, or I just don't worry about things that weren't done that still need to be done, and know that those are things that'll be done the next day.
Forget it, it can wait.
Yeah.
Okay?
I try not to do dishes or laundry. They're the bane
Okay.
of my existence right now.
I had an old gentleman in my church in Pennsylvania, and he would not go out and down the sidewalk to get his mail out of the mailbox on Sabbath. It stayed there till after the Sabbath, and then he would go get his mail. Everybody is different. And that's what I'm asking you to share. What's different at your house?
We try not to talk about the everyday things, you know, the bills and the finances and the worries and this and that, and just enjoy the time together.
That's the way it's supposed to be. Who else wants to share what's different at your
Friday
house?
evening was spent with prayer meeting Bible study. And that's one of the things I miss here. I try to make it special. The computer goes off and it doesn't go on again until after the Sabbath, for example.
In your volume of books, where you at now, Don?
Pardon?
I say, in your volumes of books that you're writing about your life, where are you, what year are you at now?
I'm almost to 1982.
Boy, 82.
That was a good year.
And he has a stack of books this high that he's already written, and he's only to 82. Okay. Okay, what's different at your house about the Sabbath? Anybody else?
On Friday, I try and get my laundry done and shopping and all of those things. And by sunset, I will turn off the TV and usually get into God's Word or just put on some nice Christian music and kind of relax and take it easy and prayer with the Lord.
Friday is the preparation day. We're going to get into that in one of our other chapters. But Friday is the preparation day. I like to hear the things that you do on Friday to get ready for the Sabbath.
I get done with work a little early. I'm done usually at 3 on Fridays, so we can be home and clean up the house and put the schoolwork away, and then we have a meal together. Sometimes have friends into the home. We don't always light candles every week, and sometimes we do fancy china, but most often these days we don't. Just have a meal together.
We didn't always light a candle, and we'll talk about candles later. But for a while we were into candle making, and we'd make these big candles, and then we would light one on Friday evening and let it burn until Sabbath evening. Okay, well, let's talk about the Sabbath day a little bit. The Sabbath day is a holy day. The other days when God created the heavens and separated the waters and created the sun and the moon and the stars and all the grass and the green things, and then man himself, and then on the seventh day he rested from all that he had created. Not only did he rest on the Sabbath day from the creation, but he made the Sabbath day holy. Yes. And he made it holy. That's very important. You guys mentioned a lot of things that you do at your house or don't do on the Sabbath day. Among them, things that you mentioned was things that made the Sabbath holy, or that you made the Sabbath holy by what you did or not do. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Did God rest on the first day?
No,
Did he bless the second day?
no,
Did he make the third day holy?
no.
I'd like to see a little more.
If you have nothing else, shake your heads.
There you go. No, he did not on all of the other days. And, man, when you drove here today and the sun was brightly shining, was it last night or the night before, was a full moon? All the stars in the sky is blue, the grass is green. He puts the flowers, he paints the flowers, and the same flower that's blue this year will be blue next year and so on, and the one right beside it that's red will continue. God did that. In his creating, he did all of that. And even that, even the beauty that we see around us, he didn't bless it or make it holy. He just created it and said, boy, that's good. But on the seventh day, he blessed it and he made it holy. Okay? What is your definition of holy?
Set aside.
It's awesome.
Set aside, okay. Some more?
I like the idea that rest is holy. That's what I do best on the Sabbath.
I'm with you, buddy, right now. Wasn't always that way, but it is now. Somebody else, what's your definition of holy?
It's awesome time to draw close to God.
Okay.
God focused.
A definition of the word holy. How does that grab you?
Completely other.
If you look it up in your dictionary, your secular dictionary, it will probably say something like holy means sacred. It means set aside or set apart for a special use. And God made the Sabbath day holy. It is set aside for a special purpose.
Yes.
It's sacred. It's sacred time. Let me find another. In the scriptures, we start at creation, and then we have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and their descendants ended up in Egypt with Pharaoh as the head honcho. How long were they in Egypt?
Over 400 years.
400 years. And in those 400 years, they went from being a special people in Egypt to slaves. And even that they were banned across the the way in Egypt so that they were separated from the Egyptians and they were slaves. They made bricks or whatever for Pharaoh's buildings in Egypt. After they were in Egypt for 400 years, God took them out. Who did he designate to lead them out of Egypt?
Moses.
Moses, okay? You're allowed to answer, kids. You know, don't let these old folks intimidate you. So, Moses led the people out of Egypt, and soon after they left Egypt, God called Moses up on the mountains and gave him the 10 Commandments. Now, according to our laws today, the 10 Commandments are still legal. And some take exception to that and say that, well, the Sabbath day, that was just for those folks back there. So that really isn't a meaningful part of the 10 Commandments. But when God gave the 10 Commandments, and he came to this fourth one, what does it say?
Says to keep it holy.
What's the first word there?
Remember.
Remember. If they're to remember, it must have been something that happened before, and they were now to remember that. What are they to remember? The Sabbath day. Why?
To keep it holy.
Because God made it holy. When?
Creation.
At creation. So at creation, God established the seventh day, what we call the Sabbath. And then when he gave them the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not do this and that, he said when he came to the fourth one, remember something that happened a long time ago. Remember how God created the world and the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. And not only did he rest, he did what? What else did he do?
Blessed it.
He blessed it, okay, and what else did he do?
Made it holy.
Come on.
He rested.
He rested and he made it holy, okay. It was holy, and so in our definition of holy, God blessed the seventh day and set it apart. He blessed the seventh day and he made it special. He made it sacred. He made it holy. And so when we get to the 10 Commandments, God says, all these thou shalt nots and so on, but he said, remember. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Holy is to be set apart for God, separated, consecrated. These are the words that describe holy. Okay. How do you keep the Sabbath day holy? By doing the things that you talked about, or by not doing other things. But along the way in history, God got very disturbed with these children of Israel, these people, his chosen people. because they were not keeping his Sabbath. Okay, I need another definition now. What is your definition of profanity? I think we're steering off course here a little, but we'll get it together. What is your definition of profanity?
It's exactly the opposite of holiness.
Okay, somebody else?
To make something common,
Yeah.
bring it down or debase it.
Okay.
To misuse something that's holy.
Vulgar.
Cussing.
Not showing God honor.
Condescending.
Walker, what's your definition of profanity? He's looking around to see where this guy is.
It's actually
Well, I would think that society-wise, the most common definition of profanity is cursing,
Yeah.
which it has a lot of definitions. The original being, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. There's your original profanity.
I thought that would be the first answer. Well, the reason we ask that is because so many times we profane God and we profane the Sabbath day itself. How would you profane the Sabbath?
by not honoring it, by not remembering it.
Well, now, let me see if we have one here that tells us.
Doing the same thing on Sabbath that you would every other day.
And so how do you profane the name of God?
You use it inappropriately.
Okay. In the Old Testament, God was, well, at one time he was talking to the priests. The priests, not the common person, the priest. And he said to the priests, you guys have profaned my Sabbath. Why? Well, because these priests were okaying buying, selling, making the Sabbath day common like the other days of the week. They were profaning the Lord. Here's what they were doing. They were do not distinguish between the holy and the common. The good dishes and the everyday dishes. They were getting them mixed up. What they did in those days, when it came to be Sabbath, see, they lived in the city, and mostly walled city, and they would have their fields where they planted their crops or gardens outside the walls of the city, and then they would bring them in and either sell them or use them. Well, now, what they were doing was they left the gates open on the Sabbath day. And people were bringing their crops into the city, either for their own use or to buy and to sell their crops on the Sabbath day. So they were making the Sabbath day the same as the other days. They were making the common things to be used and okay on the Sabbath day. And how do we do that? Do you ever profane the Sabbath? Well, that's a tough one, isn't it?
Yes.
You know, but you don't want to say. Well, we're not
Instead
here.
of honoring God, we use it for our own selfish enhancement in business.
We go ahead and do things on the Sabbath that perhaps in your eyes would be profaning the Sabbath. But if we would stop to think about the things that we do on the Sabbath day, in the eyes of God, is that profaning the Sabbath? God called them on it in the Old Testament. Is God calling us on that today? They didn't distinguish between the holy and the common. They even taught that there's no difference
Well,
between the Sabbath day and the other days of the week. Boy, they were really, go ahead, Mary.
well, that's one of the arguments I've heard for years from Sunday keepers, that, well, we keep every day. You know, you should be worshiping God every day. And
Well-
yet, which is true to a point, but what they're doing in essence is they're not separating the common from the holy.
Right. And that's what we fail to do so many times. Okay, let's talk about a different time zone. The Sabbath day is a different time zone. It's sacred, it's consecrated, it's made holy, it's all of these things. When does the Sabbath day start?
Sundown on Friday.
When?
Sundown on Friday.
Sundown on Friday. Ooh. And when does it end?
Sundown on Saturday.
Sundown on Saturday. So we're in a sacred time zone on the Sabbath day. Oh boy, how about profaning the Sabbath by fudging on those time zones? When did God say, oh, there it is, yeah. from evening until evening. Boy, that's a tough one there in our day and age. How many times do I get a little anxious when it comes toward the end of the Sabbath day? Because I want to do something, or I want to go somewhere. And so we begin to fudge it. There is a time zone that God expects us to keep. And if we are not within that time zone, are we then profaning the Sabbath?
Yes.
Shake your head, yes. Okay.
One of the biggest for us today is sports.
Is what?
Sports.
Oh, sports. When my son, my older son Don, most of you know, when he was in high school, he played football. And up until that time, from the time he grew up, he knew and learned about the Sabbath. He knew that his parents would not want him to play football on the Sabbath. But is that good enough? Should that be the reason?
No.
When his coach asked him about playing on the Sabbath day, he gave his coach the response that God didn't want him to play football on the Sabbath. That was his belief, not only his parents. There is a time zone that if we violate that time zone, we are profaning the Sabbath. Wow. That hurts a little, doesn't it? Well, how about boundaries? Let's talk about boundaries for a few minutes. What are boundaries for the Sabbath anyhow? If we have that time zone, how do we get ready for this Sabbath, this holy day, this day that is sacred and set apart?
Well, one is the time, the sunset to sunset.
Yes.
Those are the boundaries.
And you prepare on Friday so that you don't have to do unnecessary things on Saturday.
Okay.
You still have to change the baby's diaper and feed your family, but you can do those things maybe a little easier way than, or, you know, if you have food made ahead of time or.
It was what did they call it in the scriptures? It was the preparation day. Remember when Jesus was crucified and he was in the tomb and the women did not go to the tomb because it was the
Day of perspiration.
preparation day. It was the preparation day. Okay. How can we or how should we, or how do you utilize the preparation day?
Not enough.
This is different in every one of your families.
It's hard when you have little ones.
Some do a lot and some do very little. I'm gonna give you a tough one here. I want your answer for it then. My wife, as I said before, she was a great baker. Well, she was great everywhere, but she was a great baker. And among other things, on the preparation day, she would always bake. So we had lots of goodies and good sweet stuff to eat on the Sabbath day. Now, she was preparing. However, when the Sabbath day came, of course, she would get up in the morning and she'd put all of the meat and taters or whatever in the oven to cook while we were at church. And came after church, we would go home and we would usually always have a great feast on Sabbath day because we invited other people to come and eat with us. Now, being the preparation day, we had people in our church who would never do that. They would not invite anybody home. They would not cook a meal on Sabbath day. They were very, very strict. Now, in your opinion, and you can say just what you want, because my wife is gone now. She can't hear you what you say. Which was right? Was it right for her to cook a big meal on the Sabbath day? In the old Jewish customs and scripture, that would have been a no-no.
I think both are right.
But that,
I think both are right.
both are right. You don't think she was profaning the Sabbath doing that?
I don't. Because she was doing something that was set apart. She was being a servant, and she was honoring God by how she welcomed people into your home. And she was using her gifts, and I don't think that was profaning the Sabbath at all. It's not something she did every day. Something very different and set apart. And for your family, that was how you honored the Sabbath. And the other families that didn't do any preparation or didn't do any cooking, that was fine for them, because that's how they felt they needed to honor the Sabbath.
Somebody else?
Jesus did not profane the Sabbath when he healed someone on the Sabbath. So I don't think your wife profaned the Sabbath because she used her gift of cooking and hospitality to make the Sabbath enjoyable and holy for other families.
Amen.
It's good to do good on the Sabbath.
And the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So we may not have time to enjoy the fellowship with believers on the other days of the week, but on the Sabbath, you do have that time. So to invite someone into your home or to go to a restaurant and spend that time with somebody else as well, you're enjoying what God has given you in your relationships.
It appears that none of you felt that she was profaning the Sabbath.
You brought up the Jewish laws, that this would have been a definite, but that's legalism. those were Jewish laws. They had 630 of them regarding the Sabbath day alone, for what you could and could not do, and you couldn't do much. I agree that either way would be correct. I can't speak firsthand to this, but you all know Brandon Crandall and Alfred, New York, which at one point in our church history was very solidly Seventh-day Baptist. And Brandon and fellow Seventh-day Baptists were, when they were in high school, were football players. They couldn't play on the Sabbath. So the school district actually, and they wanted them to play, so the school district actually changed the times when their team would play to earlier on a Friday or to another day of the week. And in fact, there was enough pressure put on from the church that the post office was closed on Saturday and open on Sunday.
Wow,
So
I never heard that.
if you have enough faith and enough belief and enough pressure, you can sway what is commonplace for the rest of the world to follow what the Bible says. Or you can just sit back and say, well, it really doesn't make any difference. And then there's enough people in this room that are old enough that remember that stores used to be closed on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Bars didn't open on Sunday in a lot of places, or they didn't open till noon. I remember bars being closed on election day. There used to be a sense of importance put to Sabbath. Businesses closed on Good Friday so people could go to church. That doesn't happen anymore.
Now there's sales.
Hmm?
Now there's sales on Good Friday.
Yeah.
Well, and here in town, when my children were growing up, there were no extracurricular activities and no homework given on Wednesday. Because that was religious education. You had the Lutheran, the LRE there, you had the Catholic, and which is one, and then we started doing Awana on Wednesday. And now it's not the case. Now I have grandchildren going through the Milton Public School. I'm going, whoa. It was my daughter-in-law saying, well, the girls might not be able to go to Awana tonight because they have to do their homework first. What? Why is there homework on Wednesday? When my children were playing soccer. And of course, and I remember talking to people in charge of it saying, can't we do this on Sunday afternoon, as opposed to Sabbath morning? And apparently I didn't have enough influence. But what did happen, and I'm sure that some people will see this as profaning the Sabbath, Pastor George offered to coach, but he would only coach 8 o'clock games. So all the Seventh-day Baptist children that played soccer all played on his team. We all played at 8 o'clock, which I'm like, really? So we played at 8 o'clock so that we could get home and get ready and go to church.
In our community in Pennsylvania was very similar to what he was describing. Fortunately, or otherwise, we had football players from our church, Sabbath keepers, who were really good. And the school couldn't win without them. So they observed the Sabbath, changed the rules, played the games on a different day. Until after a few years went by, that was good, and Seventh-day Baptists were cheering. when we had a Seventh-day Baptist from a neighboring church that he agreed to play on the Sabbath. And then his friend agreed to play on it. And the next thing you know, Sabbath had no respect with the school district, no influence, and they changed the rules once again and went with everything else, and of course that's the way it is today. So,
I used to make rounds on the Sabbath. I had a friend, someone who was Jewish, and he didn't make rounds on the Sabbath. He offered to do anything, in fact, take the emergency call that he was scheduled for Sabbath, he would trade for Sunday, for somebody. But anyway, I'd make rounds, but I felt a little guilty about it. And so I would spend more time with the patients in the hospital, since I had more time on the Sabbath to do this. And we would chat, and we would, it was a different sort of rounds, but I was making rounds on the Sabbath, which I guess at the time I thought maybe profaning the Sabbath.
I'll give you an example from my life, and you tell me then. I worked for an oil company, and I was very good at fixing or repairing oil burners. Okay? And of course I never worked on the Sabbath day. But one day, the boss called me and said that there's a burner that's down at the warehouse, and if it's not fixed, why people or a lot of commodities will be destroyed. It's cold. And he said, there's nobody can fix that except you. I went and fixed that oil burner that day. I never turned in any time to get paid for it during that day. Was I profaning the Sabbath?
No.
I think Jesus would have said no.
How do you know?
Because you were doing a service, and Jesus said that Christians should be serving.
And somebody would have been hurt, you know, if they didn't have heat to keep them warm, then other people would be hurt by that. So you're pulling a mule out of a hole on a Sabbath.
But your Jewish neighbors would say, aha, I saw you were out working on the Sabbath.
Does it matter what your neighbors say or what God says?
How do you hear what God says?
You listen.
You listen,
Yeah.
and he shouts down from the clouds, thou shalt not, or whatever.
He speaks gently through the Holy Spirit.
I'm so thankful that God's the judge. He knows what's in our heart.
He does. Okay, at the end of this chapter, there's a few questions. We have time to take one or two of them. Think about the good china versus the everyday stuff. How does this illustrate Sabbath keeping?
You're making it special.
Boy, I thought after all our discussion, everybody would, hey, I want to ask.
You take care with the china. You put it in a special place. You wash it by hand. You take, you know, special care. Like I don't let my children carry the china, I put it back away so that we're making sure it doesn't get broken.
And you don't use it for ordinary purposes.
Like hot dog.
There's a certain reverence.
Yeah.
Kosher.
The Sabbath is separate, it's special, it's sacred, it's holy, it's 24 hours, it's all of these things. And next Sabbath, when the preparation day is over and Sabbath day is starting, please remember the good dishes and the everyday dishes.
Great analogy.
According to the part that we talked about, God's holy day, what is the basis? What is the real basis for keeping the Sabbath day?
The commandment to do so?
What's that?
The commandment to do so?
Okay. The commandment only says remember. It's not a commandment. It's a remember. So we have to go back a little further yet. What is the basis for keeping the Sabbath day?
Creation.
Because God did it himself.
Because of creation. God
Blessed.
made the seventh day, He blessed it, and He made it holy.
He modeled it for us.
And He even modeled it because He rested on the seventh day.
When we light the candles, we usually light 2 candles, and we'd say, because He blessed it and He made it holy, or we remember and we observe.
My first introduction to the Sabbath was when we moved to town, and we lived across the alley from Spence Howard, right? Howard, right?
Yeah.
And my father made some comment about, they go to church on Saturday like the Jews, which my parents, of course, had lots of experience with Jewish families. Well then, when I was 17, I got a job in Chicago, in Highland Park, being a nanny for a family. Well, it turns out they were Jewish. And so Friday night, we would light candles and do they did the whole welcoming of the Sabbath, and of course in Hebrew, and that was my first experience, which in hindsight was pretty cool. It was a really cool thing.
What's the purpose of lighting candles on the Sabbath? As I mentioned before, we did it for a while at our house. I was into candle making, and I made beautiful candles and all that we used. But why? Why do you light a candle on Sabbath?
Isn't it the woman in the house does it, and she's ushering in the light of the world, because the Lord came by way of a woman?
Who lights the candle?
The woman in the house.
The woman in the house.
We see that in Fiddler on the Roof, right? When
Yeah.
they do the Sabbath song, she's,
But don't you think originally it was actually the fire in the hearth, so it wouldn't go out, that there was some practical purpose for it too? I mean, you couldn't be carrying wood on the Sabbath, so at least if you had
You had to bank your coals.
You do
some,
that anyways.
One of those many rules for Sabbath was you can't light a fire, so you have to light the
So
candle.
if you kept it burning, you at least had your heat source?
So you cook your dinner on that candle.
Well, no, not practically, it's symbolic for us.
You could roast a marshmallow and have s'mores.
Sabbath s'mores.
But they have stoves and things now that have Sabbath
Yep.
time.
Ours does.
Uh-huh.
What, say that again?
There's a Sabbath mode on the stove we bought.
Really? Oh, because you bought a kosher.
So you don't actually have to flip the switch on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
I never heard of such a thing.
There's also buildings in New York that are predominantly Jewish, and they have a Sabbath mode on the elevator. During the Sabbath, the elevator will continually go up and down and stop at every floor so that no one has to push a button. I'm not making this up.
I believe you.
I'll
I
have,
can't believe I've never heard of this.
What about the engineer that has to provide the electricity to?
Yeah, the person
It's
keeping
what
the
Goyim
boiler
for.
going. Speaking of, we're gonna go play with boilers
Israel
today.
also at a lot of the
Yeah.
hotels.
Yeah, in Israel, a lot of the hotels are that way, he's saying.
Yeah, but when you have boiler, radiant heat or boiler heat, steam heat, somebody has to keep that going.
You get your goy to do it, your non-Jewish neighbor to get you.
Yeah, because somebody's got to watch it. You don't walk away from that puppy. Interesting.
Is that honoring God and is that honoring the day?
Yeah.
every one
That's
of
what you like
us,
to push elevator buttons. I mean,
hey, my son was just in Israel a few weeks ago, and he brought home some interesting pictures of signs that would say, let me think now, they couldn't buy a Coke on the Sabbath. And there were signs, we would call them ridiculous, but they were very Jewish signs. And where they were, they could not buy a meal on Sabbath. But they could go to the neighboring town where the Palestinians or whatever lived. Their Sabbath was Friday, and so they could eat over there, but they could not eat here because it was very Jewish. The Jews today hold on to many of the customs that profaned the Sabbath back then. So every one of us keep the Sabbath day differently. And that's okay. We're not in this class asking anybody to change the way they keep the Sabbath. If in the course of time and the things that we learn, you wish to change your Sabbath, that's up to you and your God. But I honor each one of you for coming here to try to learn more about your relationship with God. The more it's the title of the book, True to Our God, True to the Sabbath. The closer you are to keeping the Sabbath, the closer your life is to God.
Yes.
So is it wrong to go to eat, or is it wrong to go to eat or to go to a sporting event on Sabbath?
I am not here to tell you what to do or not what to do. That's between you and your God. We do talk about a lot of how the Jewish people did and how they do now. It's a problem sometimes separating what God wanted them to do and what their priests wanted them to do. As somebody mentioned, 630 rules for keeping the Sabbath. Well, God only gave them one, to keep it holy. And so, don't ask me what's right or wrong. I will counsel you according to the way I keep the Sabbath. And the way I have in my life, the way I have changed. But it's the way I keep the Sabbath doesn't count. What counts is between you and your God and how you understand to keep the Sabbath.
Question. Question over here.
Okay,
So it seems like the few questions that were raised, whether you're gonna go out to eat, whether you're gonna do sports, or play soccer at 8 AM, or bake on a Friday, you pose the question, is it profaning? And everybody kind of gives reasons and says no. So it seems like we can rationalize any particular thing we want to do, unless you're saying between you and God, if you're convicted otherwise and you do it anyway, that would be the thing that profanes the Sabbath? Is that?
if you're convicted of God and you do it anyway, yes, that's profaning the Sabbath.
Okay, so that's the only thing we can say for sure. We can say Jews did it this way, we do it this way. It's between you and the Lord, but your convictions and your conscience really make it clear.
Let me answer the question this way. Come back next week and the next week and the next week. We'll get into these kind of things in the weeks to come. Okay? Thank you very much for coming this week. Does everybody have a book now? Okay, read chapter 2 for next week. Chapter 2.